You can see then why the American South in the years immediately after 1965 might well be considered along with, say, Poland immediately after communist rule, or South Africa immediately after apartheid, or Chile after Pinochet. Why the South could be considered a transitional society deeply in need of transitional justice. In ways crucial to restorative justice, however, the region was and remains unlike those transitional nations. First and most obvious, the South, though housing a distinctive culture organized by its own racial norms, was not a sovereign nation during the Jim Crow era, nor was it a unified political entity. This lack of sovereignty and unity exerted contradictory forces, shaping the region's willingness and ability to confront its own past. The second difference, resulting from the constraints and opportunities inherent in the region's lack of sovereignty, was that unlike the transformations that were experienced by most transitional societies, those that swept the South after 1965 were largely forced on the region from outside, from America. Consequently, and this is the third difference between the region and other transitional societies, those who had once been powerless, black Southerners, gained political power after 1965, specifically the ballot, but unlike the Solidarity dissidents in Poland or blacks in South Africa, African Americans in the region did not assume, for the most part, formal positions of political authority, certainly not at the state level, and certainly not immediately. Those positions remained in the hands of white Southerners, but newly enfranchised African Americans did nonetheless alter the dynamic and semantics of politics in the region. Race baiting and the language of overt racism and white supremacy in political contest fairly quickly went by the wayside in what historian Hugh Graham calls the detoxification of Southern politics. In a sense, then, the South functioned after 1965 as a new transitional regime, but the premise and promise of newness was distorted and partially defamed by the continuation in power of whites who were members of the old regime. 40 or so years ago, then, these three factors coalesced to stifle any move toward transitional justice of the sort I've thus far discussed. Toward, that is, finding some way to address and redress the suffering of the victims of Jim Crow, and finding some way to hold those who were historically responsible for that suffering also morally, even legally responsible for that suffering. So it was that Southern blacks and Southern whites remained divided after 1965, unreconciled, each for the most part intensely tolerating the other, most having acute autobiographical knowledge of a dark past, and each knowing too that that past, that very potent racial past, was, to quote Faulkner again, not dead, not even past. Some, though, might dispute Faulkner's claim, arguing in effect that the South since the years of Jim Crow has changed a great deal. And so it has. Today, the South, without doubt, is a more equitable, more humane, more just, and more tolerant place than it was when I entered college in the Mississippi Delta in 1965. This must never be forgotten. However, change of this magnitude should not license us to forget the past. Indeed, on occasion, and I think this is one of those occasions, change only throws the past into sharper relief, and I think that's precisely what you were suggesting as well. And in point of fact, the Southern past lives in many ways. It resides in the hearts and minds of those of us, black and white, who lived through those tumultuous times. It is embodied in federal and state law and in government mandates, policies, resolutions. We see and read about the past in films, novels, textbooks, research monographs, classroom curriculum, gatherings such as this. The past is now expressed, as Renee said, in numerous commemorative venues, in streets named for the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., for example, in civil rights museums in Memphis, Atlanta, Birmingham, throughout the region, and in memorials of one sort or another, such as Maya Lin's astonishingly moving, cleansing fountain at the Southern Poverty Law Center, which lists the names of those killed for reasons of race. It exists in the memorial in Tulsa, Oklahoma, commemorating the racial violence in that city, where in 1921, white mobs burned a 35-block black business district and killed upward of 250 African Americans. And finally, the past permeates the everyday lives and deaths of Southerners today. To return for a moment to restorative and reconciliation efforts, as you have just heard, for the last 20 years or so, increasingly frequent they are in the South, but in keeping with the demographic composition and political contours of the region, it is, as I have said, home to a large number of politically empowered African Americans, but it is neither a sovereign nor a unified political entity. These restorative projects have been of varying intensity and duration, often small scale, and almost inevitably piecemeal and decentralized. Alabama and Mississippi, for example, have thus far focused their energies on the pursuit of criminal justice by bringing a handful of the most notorious civil rights era, civil rights related killings into the present, and prosecuting, convicting, and incarcerating those judged responsible for those murders. 11 murderers, in fact, have been brought to justice. And while this may seem like a small number, Maya Lynn's Montgomery Monument names 40 individuals who were killed during this period. Those 11 are precisely 11 more than many would have thought possible 20 years ago, and shows real, if belated and still woefully incomplete, progress in coming to grips with a murderer's past. Since 1989, moreover, state and federal authorities have made about 30 arrests, resulting in 23 convictions for crimes committed during the Civil Rights era. Byron D. LeVecq's 1994 trial and conviction for the murder of civil rights activist Medgar Evers in Mississippi is especially important because it established the precedent that crimes committed decades earlier are not subject to a time-bound statute of limitation, meaning that killers with blood on their hands are fair game for prosecution. Beckwith's conviction also served notice of the movement-induced empowerment of African Americans. All-white juries failed twice to convict him in 1964, while the jury that did convict Beckwith in 1994 included 8 African American judges. We are apt to see still more efforts at restorative justice as criminal justice. The Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, has identified an additional 74 persons whom it calls the forgotten. People killed between 1952 and 1968 in circumstances suggesting they were victims of racially motivated violence. We very well may see these names and others as yet unearthed in tomorrow's newspapers if and as authorities reinvestigate their deaths. Members of Congress have followed the logic of these atonement trials, as I call them, in cold cases, such as the killings of the Southern Poverty Law Center's forgotten, to the point of passing the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act of 2007, a bill signed into law by President Bush last October. The Till bill was sponsored by Georgia Representative John Lewis, obviously a certified civil rights hero, and authorizes the appropriation of more than $10 million for the next decade for the Justice Department to investigate and prosecute civil rights-related unsolved homicides committed before 1970. Moving now to the realm of restorative justice as repair and reparation, which does not, again, necessarily entail financial payments, we have first apology Southern style. A few Southern states, Alabama, Florida, Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia, a few Southern universities, University of Alabama, University of North Carolina, a few large corporations in the South have in the past few years apologized or expressed regret for slavery, if not for Jim Crow per se.